Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Chairperson of Council, Honorable Blade Nzimande, Minister of Higher Education and Training, and other ministers. The Vice Chancellor did me a favor by acknowledging all the important people who are here. So I endorse that acknowledgement. I had noticed, Vice Chancellor, that you hadn't seen the President who was then sitting immediately behind you. I mean the Archbishop Makhoba, and I don't know if I trust him behind my back. But thanks, Archbishop. I also thought I was very glad that Louis handed over these books because it enabled us to acknowledge these other important people who are with us today. That includes our leader, Andrew Mlangeni. You know, I always try to avoid him because, as you know, he is chairperson of the Integrity Commission of the ANC, so I don't know what he would say about my integrity. But I was also glad to see these eminent artists of ours who received these books as honorary doctors. But Chairperson of Council and members of Council and Vice Chancellor, members of management, Chairperson of Senate and the academic staff, the President of the SRC and student staff and workers, distinguished guests, comrades, friends, ladies and gentlemen. I'm indeed privileged to take this opportunity to convey my humble appreciation of the honor extended to me by the community of the University of South Africa, led by its council, as it elected me to serve as the Chancellor of this eminent center of learning, of teaching, and of research. In this context, I'd like to salute my immediate predecessor, the Judge President Bernard Mwepe, and thank you very much, Judge, for being present here today. whom I have been honored personally to observe over a number of years as he served with rare distinction and dignity as Chancellor of UNISA. And throughout these years, I've been conscious of the fortune UNISA has had that it had him as its Chancellor, given his standing as one of our outstanding lawyers and jurists, a co-architect of our critically important post-apartheid constitutional order, and a senior member of both the South African and the African continental judiciary. I take this opportunity to pledge that I will try to do my best to honor the tradition of chancellorship that he has pioneered. Always mindful to rely on his tutorship to do the right thing correctly to serve this university and our system of higher education as a whole. And in this regard, among others, I will keep in mind the advice he gave when he said, be interested in the affairs of the university, obviously within limits as a mere titular head. I hope you all will bear that in mind, that I'm only the titular head. And he said, UNISA is a big institution and has many activities. So it is always rewarding to attend as many as possible. In this way, you will be part of the university community, understand its objectives, hopes, and even fears or concerns. And he said, when I came, I asked that the Chancellor's addresses not be too long at graduations. And I hope, he said, this remains because our graduates' minds are on the conferment of their degrees and they want to go home and groove, unquote. On the 18th of June 2003, when I addressed the National Assembly as it considered the budget vote of the presidency, I said, and I quote, that we're pleased that we've now established a higher education presidential working group that brings together the vice chancellors of the universities and the technicons, such as they were then, and members of cabinet chaired by the president. And said the critical challenge for this working group is to contribute to the development of a shared agenda for the transformation of the system of higher education and to reposition the institutions in this sector to play a more meaningful role in the transformation of our society, unquote. And accordingly, the agenda of the working group included the very challenges which have more recently resulted in open political struggles about such relevant matters as the financing of the universities, providing for the higher intakes of students with special reference to black students from poor families and disadvantaged schools, and the expansion of the pool of university teaching staffs, bearing in mind the need to address the challenges of non-racism and non-sexism in this context, bearing in mind the curriculum development thus to Africanized teaching in our universities, improving research and the production of new knowledge in our universities, focused on the imperative to expand the intellectual cadre and knowledge which would help our country and continent more effectively to address our multidisciplinary challenges, and finally streamlining the interaction between the government and academia. And in that context, I recall that after a number of meetings of the working group, a ministerial subcommittee, which included the president, prepared and circulated a discussion document entitled "The Challenges Facing Higher Education in South Africa," which was dated the 1st of June 2005. And naturally, this provoked a response from our leaders in higher education, some of which contested the views expressed by government. And writing of this report in an article published in 2007, Ms. Piyushi Kotecha, then CEO of the Southern African Regional Universities Association, said that the sense of urgency for higher education is clearly conveyed in a remarkable discussion paper released by the government in June 2005. And she said the document raises a sustained critique of the sector, accusing its leadership of being, quote, too close to the coalface, unquote, to understand the critical role that the university needs to play in society. And she said the gist of the critique offered on the universities is that we are collectively and individually underperforming, that we may well not be focusing on the right areas, and that the sector lacks self-confidence. It is, in the words of the document, she said, timid. And the document criticizes the role of academics as being too much of trainers rather than that of innovators, unquote. Well, that was 2005. I'm sure much has changed since then. But Ms. Kotecha then posed the question, are we getting a message from government that higher education needs to reconfigure itself once more in order to meet global challenges for excellence in higher education? I'm certain that many of our distinguished participants at this occasion today will recall that in the context of the potted history I've sought to convey, the then Vice Chancellor and Principal of UNISA, the esteemed Professor Dr. Nyameko Pani-Pichana, who is here fortunately with us, wrote an open letter to the then President, Mbeki. And in this detailed and still relevant April 6, 2005 open letter to the President, Dr. Pichana said, among others, that you were right to raise three critical questions about higher education policy in South Africa during your presidential working group meeting the other day. you asked the questions as to whether society was clear enough in its expectations of higher education, whether we know what resources are necessary to produce such outcomes as we shall determine, and finally, whether we are providing resources sufficient to enable higher education to produce the expected outcomes. And he said all of these are critical questions, but higher education can never function in isolation from the challenges society faces. Higher education must be sustained by the goodwill of the society it seeks to serve, and that society must express confidence in its capacity to produce public good and to dream its future. And he said government has a vital role in creating that environment, but its public investment in higher education by seeking and drawing together partners from the private sector and by generating the confidence of the society. And he said, unless we do that, we should never be surprised that Africa does not feature among the 200 best universities in the world. Whatever we may make of the methodology and criteria for so determining this ranking, we cannot but recognize that we are some way from the league of world-class universities. Unquote. I was very fortunate to have found Dr. Pichana's open letter to the President, and therefore his comments, which I have just quoted. And taking advantage of what he reported then, 12 years ago, I asked the questions once again today. Is our society, that is South Africa in all of its echelons, is it clear enough in its expectations of higher education? Does it know what resources are necessary to produce such outcomes as it shall determine? And is our society providing resources sufficient to enable higher education to produce the expected outcomes? I suspect that you, dear friends, believe that I have posed these important questions concerning the critical matter of higher education, in part because I have a view about how we should answer them. And I would like to confirm that indeed, if I'm right in this regard, you are correct in your belief. I do indeed have a view about what the objective and truthful response to these questions should be. But however, I'd like to plead your indulgence that you allow me the space to delay this response. And this is because, as you know, currently sitting is a Commission of Inquiry into Higher Education and Training, chaired by the Honorable Judge Jonathan Heha, who's mandated, among others, to make recommendations on the feasibility of making higher education and training fee-free in South Africa, and having regard to the Constitution of the Republic, all relevant higher and basic education legislation, and so on. I believe that it is correct that we await the report of the Commission of Inquiry, which may very well make recommendations which would address the challenges of higher education, many of which were identified by Dr. Pani Pichana in the open letter to the President that I've cited. And I trust that you will agree with me in this regard, relating only to the issue of the timing of the response to the important questions we posed in 2005. And that said, I trust that the report of the Commission will also alert us to the imperative to engage the whole nation in a serious discussion about the larger challenge of how we should structure our public expenditures over the medium term at least. This arises from the hard reality that our democratic state continues to be faced with the task to address the very many and detailed challenges centered on what our Constitution demands with regard to correcting the injustices of the past and building the new South Africa. And each of these demands the spending of public revenues in a situation which objectively the state has finite resources whose quantum is principally determined by the possibility of our economy to produce the new wealth from which these public revenues would be drawn. Accordingly, this means that what is spent to address one social economic challenge constitutes the resources which become unavailable to meet another or other challenges. Necessarily, therefore, the national budgeting process entails making choices, or in other words, ranking the needs which must be addressed with regard both to timing and the volume of resources to be allocated. In this context, I'd like to believe that all of us share the profound hope that the HEHA Commission will indeed succeed to provide the practical answers to the urgent matter of the sustainable funding of higher education and training. And in this regard, I was pleased that the terms of reference of the Commission refer to all relevant higher and basic education legislation And to do this effectively, it must be in and of the community it has been established to serve. University of East Africa has to draw upon experiences and ideas from East Africa, as well as from the rest of the world. And it must direct its energies particularly towards the needs of East Africa. And he said it must work against prejudice of all kinds, searching always for that elusive thing, the truth. And yet it must be realized that we are in a hurry. We cannot just think and debate endlessly the pros and cons of any decisions. We have to act. We have to tackle our problems now, unquote. And only 2 years ago, in 2015, more than half a century after these comments by Julius Nyerere, the Dakar, Senegal, first African Higher Education Summit on revitalizing higher education for Africa said that African higher education institutions shall commit themselves to the pursuit of excellence in teaching and learning, research and scholarship, public service, and provision of solutions to the development challenges and opportunities facing African people across the continent. And for its part, our National Development Plan says that, quote, that higher education is a major driver of information and knowledge systems that contribute to economic development. and said, however, higher education is also important for good citizenship and for enriching and diversifying people's lives. And said universities are key to developing a nation, and they play three main functions in society. Firstly, they educate and train people with high-level skills for the employment needs of the public and private sectors. And secondly, universities are the dominant producers of new knowledge, and they critique information and find new local and global applications for existing knowledge, and that South Africa needs knowledge that equips people for a changing society and economy. And then the plan says that thirdly, given the country's apartheid history, higher education provides opportunities for social mobility. It can strengthen equity, social justice, and democracy. In today's knowledge society, higher education is increasingly important for opening up people's opportunities, unquote. I've cited these comments about the vital role of higher education in the effort to achieve Africa's development imperatives, to emphasize the point with which I agree, that everything should indeed be done in our country to ensure that this sector discharges its responsibilities in a sustainable manner. It is in this context that we must express our appreciation and understanding of the actions taken by our students in the context of their Roads Must Fall and Fees Must Fall campaigns, without approving the completely unnecessary and counterproductive violence and destruction of university property which occurred during these campaigns. And needless to say, the student movement and our society as a whole must decisively turn their backs on the forms of protests rooted in the logic of cutting off one's nose to spite one's face, as illustrated by a plethora of incidents in which we burn down clinics to demand better health care, or destroy lecture rooms because we want free education, or lay whole schools to ruin because we do not like a proposed municipal or provincial boundary. However, before I conclude, I will return to this matter of student activism in the context of our national historic tasks. I would now like to advance some general propositions. One of these is that I hold firmly, as has indeed been indicated, to the view that as Africans we have a shared responsibility to strive continuously, whatever the challenges, to achieve the renaissance of Africa. As all of us know, literally the word renaissance means rebirth. For us as citizens of Africa, of which South Africans are a component part, that renaissance means eradicating the legacy of centuries and perhaps a millennium of a demeaning European perception of Africa and Africans, as well as the stubborn material and subjective consequences of slavery, of imperialism, of colonialism, of neocolonialism, and even the misrule that we ourselves are responsible for. And the eradication of that legacy necessarily means the corollary possibility to construct something new, so that as Africans we define ourselves according to our image of ourselves, exercising our inalienable right to self-determination. Thus would we, among others, visualize our continent as one at peace within itself and with the rest of the world, free to determine its destiny, internally empowered to allow the people to govern, to put in place programs to eradicate the scourges of poverty and underdevelopment, to define the African identity through respect for our history, our languages, our cultures, and our arts, and to show Africa as secure, Africa's place as an equal among the nations and continents. It is the achievement of all this and more which would contribute to Africa's renaissance. In the context of everything I've just said, I must express my grave concern at events which took place in this city last week in the context of what was reported as an anti-immigrant march. In this context, I want to say thanks a lot to Ringo Madlingozi for what he said. He said now in the songs that he rendered. As South Africans, we should never forget the enormous sacrifices that were made by the sister peoples of Africa to help us achieve our liberation, and cannot now behave in a manner that treats other fellow Africans who are now resident in our country as enemies or unwelcome guests. And neither should we commit the offense of viewing or characterizing the African migrants in our country as criminals. When our communities discover or suspect criminal activity in their areas, regardless of the nationality of the alleged criminal or criminals, they must report this to the police service. And the police service itself has an absolute obligation to follow up on these community reports, thus to avoid the people taking the law into their own hands. And all of us know that our country faces many socioeconomic challenges, such as poverty and unemployment. Not even one of these problems can or will be solved by attacking the fellow Africans who have joined us as migrants. And those who organize and participate in these attacks, which must stop, should know that there is absolutely nothing revolutionary or progressive or patriotic or acceptable or of service to the people in what are in fact criminal activities. Earlier, I detailed some objectives we must pursue to achieve Africa's renaissance. I believe that it is obvious that none of these can be achieved without the determined, the sustained, and committed input of the African intelligentsia. And put simply, this means that the African universities, including UNISA, have a special responsibility to strive to occupy the front trenches in terms of the production of ideas and knowledge of cadres and activists who will drive Africa's effort to realize that renaissance. It is exactly in this context that the UNISA vision, as indeed the chairperson of council has mentioned, towards the African University in the service of humanity. It is in this context that this assumes particular importance. And I'm certain that many of us present here today will recall the important statements made by the Vice Chancellor and Principal here, Dr. Professor Mandla Makanya, during his investiture in 2011 concerning this important matter of being an African university. And he said, when it comes to Africanization, the development of globally relevant education is particularly important because the negation and discounting of one's humanity, contexts, peoples, creativity, inventions, technologies, languages, sciences, achievements, and struggles is antithetical to the development and denudes lives of their dignity and existence. And he said Africanization is about engendering education that is completely relevant within the context in which UNISA exists and in which it provides education. And this implies that while UNISA will remain committed to the diversity of knowledge systems evolving and deriving from the global context and global communities of knowledge, Africanization will foreground its ethos, work, and praxis. And he concluded that Africanization thus constitutes one of the key ontological expressions of UNISA's culture, unquote. And I'm sure, as all of us would know, or at least guess, there has, of course, been much discussion among the educationists about exactly what this Africanization means, and therefore what would constitute an African university. For instance, in an instructive 2010 paper, some reflections on the Africanization of higher education curricula, UNISA's own Professor Paul Prinsloo cites Joseph Mensah as having said, among others, that, quote, that the African curriculum should in the first place arise from and contribute to African canons of knowledge and praxis, not as exclusionary and opposing Western canons, but as equally worthy and scientifically rigorous and valid. And that an African curriculum has to do with the manner in which the curriculum encourages students to apply their learning to the unique challenges they face in their local communities impacted by global challenges. How does an African curriculum allow students to use a language of possibilities, growing out of cultures of blaming and dependencies to become active participants in pedagogies of rage and hope, of critique and possibility? And for his part, an emeritus professor, Jones of the University of Sierra Leone, said in 2004 that the division between the privileged and the underprivileged in Africa has resulted in social and political instability, which is bound to continue as long as a significant section of society is left out of the full participation for and enjoyment of the benefits of development. And he said, what then are some of the challenges that our academics must face if they are to fulfill their role in the surrounding society? They are to produce men and women who, in addition to their particular skills as scientists and engineers and teachers and social workers, as priests and artists, who must be sufficiently aware and committed to eradicating the social scourge. And he said, our aim in teaching should be to produce men and women who are both critical and creative. Our students should be encouraged to be thinkers and doers rather than accumulators of facts and received knowledge. And said this must be so if they are to be instruments of change, working towards the realization of a just and consequently a stable society. I believe that the point made by Professor Jones, that the African University should encourage students to be thinkers and doers rather than accumulators of facts and received knowledge, is very important because it speaks to the challenge for our universities to educate the change agents, the producers of new knowledge which Africa needs. And as educators among us know, the very concept to be educated, as it applies to university graduates, surely means the acquisition of the vital capacity rationally to question established truths, rather than being merely accumulators of facts and received knowledge. If I may, in this regard, I'd like to cite the eminent scientists Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr, outstanding creators of new knowledge in the 20th century and winners of the Nobel Prize in the sciences. And Einstein said, the important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing. One cannot help but be in awe when he contemplates the mysteries of eternity, of life, of the marvelous structure of reality. It is enough if one merely tries to comprehend a little of this mystery every day and never lose a holy curiosity. And he also said a very famous statement that whoever undertakes to set himself up as judge in the field of truth and knowledge, is shipwrecked by the laughter of the gods. And said, interestingly, education is what remains after one has forgotten everything he learned at school. And Niels Bohr advised that the opposite of a correct statement is a false statement. But the opposite of a profound truth may very well be another profound truth. In his 2011 investiture address, Vice Chancellor Makanya cited comments which had been made by Professor Paul Zeleza, in which he said, "I dream of a truly decolonized, democratized, and decentralized African universities that are autonomous yet accountable, committed to the pursuit of intellectual excellence yet rooted in their communities, effectively managed internally, yet working closely with all stakeholders. Universities that are Africanized in their staffing, in their values, in their pedagogy, in their epistemologies, and instructional languages, yet are capable of competing globally, contributing to the global pool of knowledge, and responding quickly and effectively to global changes and emerging local needs. Universities that attract students and faculty from across the continent and the diasporas, and that participate in extensive academic exchanges with universities in other parts of the world. Universities, therefore, that provide inclusive education," unquote. In 2010, I was privileged to address a summit meeting of African student leaders who had asked me to speak on the topic, the role of Africa's student leaders in developing the African continent. On that occasion, I referred to comments made by the Ghanaian novelist and thinker, Aikwe Arma, who had said during the same year, 2010, that to wake up from the spell of Eurocentrism and remake our society and our continent, Africans will have to retrieve their suppressed ability to conceive of our wholeness in both spatial and temporal terms. And he said we can begin doing this by re-articulating our dismembered society and remembering our suppressed history, our philosophy, culture, science, and the arts. And for this awakening, all necessary intellectual information, he said, exists here and now, though in scattered form. And it says it requires the work of groups of determined researchers to bring it together, to process it, and to make it widely available in forms accessible to all, these being the requisite preparations for Africa's intellectual awakening. And unquote. I then went on to say to the African student leaders, and I repeat this today, addressing more than the students, the regenerated African university must be the principal driver of that intellectual awakening, which awakening will empower the peoples of Africa to remake our societies and our continent. And I said, you, our student leaders, and the students you lead, must, through your actions, place yourselves among the principal architects of the new African university. And I think that's the task of our students. And I said, were you to succeed in this historic task of the renewal of the African university, with the benefits that would flow from this, all of us would rise and sound innovation that would reverberate across the oceans, proclaiming that you, our student leaders, had succeeded to lay the foundations for Africa at last to rebuild Carthage. More than 2 millennia after the Roman Empire, the Roman senator Cato the Elder, declared that it must be destroyed. And with its destruction, that Africa must be attached to the rest of the world as a helpless appendage, unquote. And thus it is that the historic and therefore strategic task we face as a university community, as this university community, is to join hands as a council, as management, as professors, as lecturers, researchers, students, workers, together to respond to the call made by Aikwe Arma to wake up from the spell of Eurocentrism and remake our society and our continent. And I thank you very much for your attention.